Hello and welcome to the Deliberate Leaders Podcast. Today's episode is Heal to Lead with Kelly L. Campbell. So, Kelly is a trauma-informed leadership coach, keynote speaker, and author of Heal to Lead, Revolutionizing Leadership Through Trauma Healing. Kelly writes about trauma, leadership, and consciousness via the new TLC on Substack and Entrepreneur magazine, formerly known as Forbes. Welcome to the podcast, Kelly.
How are you? I am so excited to be here. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Me too. In fact, this is just right up my alley. And I'm so excited to chat with you about all this great information that you put into this book. So I just maybe let's start off a little bit, like share about yourself, maybe how you got from entrepreneur to trauma-informed leadership coach.
Yeah, um, not through a linear path. That's sort
Okay.
of that's sort of the headline, right?
Okay.
So I'll give it to you in the way that makes sense for this trajectory.
Thanks.
It wasn't until I sold my company, my first company, that I realized that I had inadvertently created that company out of a trauma response. What I mean by that is I started a cause marketing agency when I was 22 years old, right? I didn't know any better. What happened was I was essentially using the vehicle of a business to validate and create self-worth, right? So I was essentially proving myself to myself, my mother in particular, and the world at large, whatever that meant, you know? And so I didn't recognize any of that because all of that's subconscious or unconscious behavior. I didn't recognize any of that until I actually sold the company 14 years later at 36. And
Wow.
at that time, I didn't understand what was happening, but I was almost going through a little bit of like an ego death because I didn't understand who I actually was without this title of being a CEO and having tons of employees around me and, household name clients. All of that really fed that ego and that sense of self, and it just, I guess, validated so much about um, who I was, but without any real foundation. There was like an empty foundation there, right?
Yeah.
Because during childhood, growing up in the household that I grew up in, my mother, who had mental illnesses, didn't really love herself. And so she projected that pain onto me and therefore created a story for me that I was unlovable and that I wasn't valuable and that I wasn't really worth anything. Um, and in order to counter that story, the way that I subconsciously did that was to create a business and recreate an environment where I was needed and wanted very much by my clients, my employees, partners, etc. So I say it from that perspective because I think that gives you a better through line as to why I started a business so early, so young. We call this entrepreneurial drive or, initiative taking, but really it was a trauma response.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely hear that. And it's so interesting to hear you speaking to like how it's more of this reflective process, right? It wasn't something that you could see within the creation of it all.
No.
And and it's like you had to get to like 36 and selling the company to go, oh my gosh, I'm losing my identity. And you're like, wait, I didn't choose that. It was something that I was responding to and sort of reacting to sort of salvage my worth.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And so
Okay.
that's really heavy, right? And that's a lot to take on, even at 36 years old.
Yeah.
And instead of, I didn't really trust myself either in throughout this whole time. Why would you trust yourself if your narrative is based on that kind of foundation?
Yeah.
So the one thing that I did start to trust was that my purpose at that point when I sold the agency was not to go and just invent and create another thing, right? Not to create another business and pour myself and do the whole thing over again.
Again. Yeah.
Instead, I went inward and I started exploring realms of spirituality, not religion, but spirituality and states of higher consciousness. And who was I on a soul level, right? And I know that might sound a little woo-woo, but I really wanted to understand like who I was and what I was here to contribute. And so it took me a while to start doing that. And I would say that I explored a lot of different modalities over, what would become the rest of my life, but really starting around 36. And so just being really curious and really open-minded to say, let me challenge some of my assumptions. Let
Yeah.
me move into a space that feels aligned with my values and where I feel really lit up. So the first thing that most people do when they sell their company, if they're not retiring early, is they go into consulting. So I
Yeah.
kind of had that as a default, but what was nice about that for me is it was a steady income, it was great money. I was helping other business owners and particularly agency founders. So that was great. But in the process of all of this, I was also realizing that that work was not actually totally aligned with my values because I
Yeah.
started to understand that these people, they're not bad people. They just really were focusing on the wrong things, which is how can I scale my business? How can I have more employees? How can I have more money? And they weren't asking other questions. Like, what
Yeah.
kind of impact am I having? What
Yeah.
kind of impact is scaling this business having on my health, having on my relationships? And what's driving all of this, right? So I was in this weird place of wanting to ask these different questions and still wanting to help them grow. So it was like a little bit of an influx or an inflection point rather. And it wasn't until I started asking the questions that I wanted to ask about how they were showing up was impacting their relationships, either with colleagues, employees, at home, etc. And it was
Yeah.
when I started asking those deeper questions, I started realizing that recognizing that there were patterns that were clear through lines from how their childhood trauma was impacting their leadership style. And for me, it was kind of like this mind-blowing moment of, oh, I realized how that happened for me and what that correlation was for me. And now I'm helping other people to recognize that. So that's sort of a long-winded way to say, how did I get from point A to point B?
Yeah. That was the transcendence of it all, of
Yeah.
like what you found that was really helpful, right? Is just getting people in that curious state to kind of just get curious about what's deeper,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So, I mean, and then bringing them to this awareness of just the basics of, I mean, you talked a lot about this or the beginning of this as I'm reading through a summary of the book, because I haven't had the pleasure of reading it all yet, but about conscious leadership. And
Mhm.
maybe, and so you're getting them that curiosity and awareness around like, what are you conscious of? Like a lot of this is subconscious, right? We're not even aware of what's driving us and just bringing them that to that awareness. So,
Yeah.
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and that is part of it, right? That the consciousness
Right.
aspect is a big part of it. That's where the self-awareness aspect comes in. But
Mhm.
conscious leadership unto itself is really, that was born out of the conscious capitalism movement. And that piece is about recognizing that there are things greater than yourself that you are responsible for, right? So putting people, planet, and profit on equal plane, which is not something that we have historically talked about or understood, particularly in the for-profit world.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's so many places that we can go with this conversation.
Yeah. Well, now you're talking about ecology, right? Is how can it be more ecological and sustainable for all of that? Yes. So
Mhm.
maybe give me an example of what conscious leadership is, and maybe an example of unconscious leadership, because let's begin. If someone hasn't stepped into trauma healing, right? And they're like, what? Trauma healing? Like, how do we even begin to recognize that?
Yeah. So I think that success metrics are a great place to look at those things and see where there's consciousness and low consciousness. If you're looking at success metrics and you're essentially saying, well, I'm going to base my success metrics on my revenue, the number of employees or the headcount that I have, meaning more is better, the brand recognition or Again, all of this depends on what you do for a living, what your
Yeah.
organization does, but recognition of who your clients are. All of these are ego inflations,
Yeah.
right? You're defining your success based on how you are soothing your ego or how your ego is being kind of validated, right? I am worthy and I am valuable because I have all of these things, one, two, three. Um, that's a very low conscious way to think about business. But ironically, that's how we've all been taught to think about business, right? It matters how many offices you have and how much revenue you bring in, and if you've made the Fortune 100 list and etc. But that's actually not a conscious way to think about success. If we think about conscious leadership, we're actually thinking about beyond our organization and its revenue. How are we impacting and developing the people who are working inside the organization? How are we supporting them to the point where they're going home and they're having a positive impact on their children, their partners, their family, their community? How are the ways in which our organization, whatever we do from a product or service standpoint, how are the ways in which we are impacting the environment? Are we conscious of those? And are we not only not creating more harm in doing that, how are we creating or moving into like a more regenerative approach? So very different ways of thinking, right? It's like the way that I say it in the book is egocentric versus ecocentric. And eco doesn't just mean ecology, it means ecosystem.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the whole, the totality, the holistic environment of, as organizational leaders, what are we responsible for? What are we accountable for, as you know, in the realm of leadership?
Yeah. That's so empowering. You're speaking to like that empowerment and how that ripple effect of like, how is it being a part of the better good for all of it?
Yeah, and again, this is not just pie in the sky utopia. If we want to have fiscally sustainable organizations, leaning into the people who are doing the work, making sure that you're not creating more harm and you're actually creating more, like I said before, a regenerative approach in terms of your environmental impact. These are the ways that we can keep going. If we lean against that, right, and we don't care about that, we're dumping into rivers and we're not caring about our people. At some point, that's going to break, right? Those resources are not there forever. People will leave. Water supplies and land will be poisoned, right? And I'm not saying
Yeah.
this as a doom and gloom. I'm saying this is the reality of going unchecked and just growing for the sake of growth and greed and revenue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So important. And I do feel like this conversation is just picking up in the world. I mean, we live in Idaho, and I think I grew up in a family of farmers, and there's just so much more awareness around, even in agriculture industry, around regenerative work as well,
Yeah.
and how to let it all kind of settle back into its natural ecosystem. And it's beautiful.
It's so beautiful. I'm glad that you use that word. I use that word all the time to talk about this because it is beautiful, working with the land, working with your people, right? There's no friction. I won't say no friction. There's less
Well,
friction.
because there is friction, and if people like to use this word, like, let's balance it. And it's like, well, balance doesn't really work naturally because not everything is like always equal, right? There's a harmony, like there's an
Yes.
ebb and flow, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
there's a patience to it.
Mhm.
Um, so
Just
yeah,
hard in a fast-paced world to have patience and to slow down consciously while everyone around you is saying, grow, grow, grow,
yeah,
20% margins year over year. That's your goal. Again, it depends on what your intention is.
yeah. That's so smart. Intention. So maybe starting with your intentions and reflecting upon those as a leader, as a company, as a business,
Mm.
and as a leader, and what are those intentions and how are they impacting the whole ecosystem?
Yeah. And then asking, right? Because we make a lot of assumptions as leaders.
Yes. Oh
We
my,
don't ask enough to say, we thought, like, our hypothesis was that this would be good for you. But now that it's in place and it's in existence, how is that working for you? Is that
Yeah.
working for you? Is there a way that we can support you in a different way that would be more effective, right? So yeah, opening up those conversations, being more vulnerable as a leader. Vulnerability, we've been taught, is a weakness. It is the strongest marker, right? Of like
It's
how courageous a leader is.
yes, right there. It's so courageous. In fact, I grew up with so many men in my life. I have five older brothers and they are
Oh,
just
wow.
wild beings. It's the best. I think when you start talking about vulnerability, they get a little scared. But as soon as I shift that word to like authenticity, which I think are somewhat interchangeable, it's just having the courage to be authentic. And vulnerability sometimes can sneak into authenticity, right? So I kind of begin there sometimes with those my brothers a little bit, but yeah, having the courage to be vulnerable.
Yeah. Whatever the way in is, like, I'm all for that.
Yeah. Yep. Me too. Me too. So I want to touch a little bit more on just your topic and your passion around and sort of the topic of your book of trauma.
Hmm.
So how are we seeing unprocessed trauma, I guess I'm trying to say, is how does that manifest in the workplace? And yeah, how do we recognize that?
Yeah, so many, many ways. And so when we're talking about trauma, you said unprocessed, it could also be unintegrated,
I
unresolved.
like that word. Mhm.
Um, when we think about trauma, have to start with what trauma is, right? So I think about trauma as unintegrated information and energy.
Mhm.
That's it. I use that definition, and it's not my definition, but it's the one that feels the most approachable because it kind of takes the emotion out of it, right? What we mean by trauma is every one of us has had some experience when we were younger or even in adulthood where some experience has overwhelmed our nervous system's ability to cope with some kind of stressor. Now, we're not even talking about how big or small that stressor is, just a stressor. It overwhelmed our nervous system. We couldn't cope. We got dysregulated. And now that is actually stored in our body, right? It's literally stored in our, maybe in our mental memory, right? Our mental memory bank, but also really physically stored in our fascia and our tissues and our muscles. And so if we don't do the work to actually engage with it purposefully and proactively, then it just stays there and it grows and it manifests and it eats at us, right? And we feel like we're in pain. It might manifest as chronic pain. It might
Physically.
manifest as mental illness, right? There's so many ways that that could happen. So how that shows up in the workplace is, you know, some of that projection of pain can kind of look like toxic behavior. The way that we speak to people could be like from a one downing, could be maybe a little damaging, a little berating of other people, maybe using a fear-based approach, thinking like, I can control these people if I make them scared. Again, you're not consciously thinking that, but that's the way that it sort of shoots out
Yeah.
sideways when these things are unresolved.
Yeah.
And
That's
on
fun.
that same, so that's more of like the people controlling aspect of the spectrum that I would talk about. On the other end of that spectrum, and it is a spectrum, is people pleasing, which most of us, especially as women, are familiar with.
Mhm.
We kind of grew up in a culture where people pleasing is sort of what we were taught. But it was also instilled in us from this standpoint of trauma, right? So when we were
Yeah.
told to like be quiet because we're too loud or we're too much, right? That can be a pretty traumatic experience because you're essentially being taught that who you are, exactly as you are, is not okay, is not good enough, is not acceptable. So you need to change into something else. You need to be quieter, smaller, etc. And so in leadership positions, people pleasers tend to back away a little bit. They let other people have voices, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's actually part of a hallmark of leadership. Where that goes sideways is when we are allowing other people to make the decisions almost for us and we don't step into our own power, right? We can sort of be bulldozed by
Yeah.
those unconscious or low conscious leaders. Sometimes we also, as people pleasers, in leadership roles, we take on some of the things that other people are needing help with, but we take it on to such a point that we really lean into it. We can't get our own work done. We're burnt out. We're overwhelmed. And notoriously, some things are going to slip through the cracks. So now we become unreliable,
Yeah.
right, as leaders. There's nothing worse than that when people are looking at you and wanting to trust you in lots of different ways, psychologically and all these other things. To be unreliable or perceived as unreliable as a leader is really damaging. It's ineffective, right? So whether it's on the controlling side of the spectrum or the pleasing side of the spectrum, neither one of these things is effective, right? It's just that people pleasers seem to be more kind. They seem to be more conscious, but that's the one that's a little tricky, right? I always think about, I'm sure you've had bosses in the past or encountered other leaders who were really authoritarian. And so if they come across as controlling and, as I said before, like kind of have these toxic behaviors, at least they are predictable. At
Yeah.
least you know what you're going to get. And
Yeah.
then you can decide whether you're going to engage with that or leave the organization. But at least it's predictable. With people pleasers, it's a little tricky because there's a lot of emotional manipulation that's happening.
Yep.
And the irony of all of this spectrum is that I say the spectrum is people controllers and people pleasers, but all of it is really a mechanism for control, which I boil that down even more to say it's a mechanism to create safety. That's what all of this comes down to. What we are all trying to do is create safety for ourselves because we didn't necessarily feel that at certain points in our childhood or in our upbringing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So well put. So well put. Like all of that just sort of speaks to me
It
to make me
makes sense,
recognize.
right? Like
Yeah.
I always joke around. I'm like, I'm not saying anything that's irrational, right?
No.
Yeah,
No.
I'm just saying it in a different way.
Yeah. So if we were going to go about like addressing some of this trauma, if these were some leadership styles that we've recognized,
Yeah.
it's like, um, how is it that we can like address this trauma in some simpler ways, like individually and just kind of with ourselves is like bringing more awareness to that? Where would we begin with just the reflection of our leadership style and how it's intertwined with our trauma? Like, where am I going to begin with that?
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's about getting curious, and that's where you're going to start to develop some self-awareness, right? And so some of the simple questions that you can ask if you're open to it, and you have to be open to that, right? But if you're listening to this conversation, that already tells me that you're open to it. If you haven't, shut this off already, you're open to it. And so just thinking about, let's say when you're leading some kind of conversation with a group, maybe you lead a team of people. If you tend to ask a question and then be the first one to answer, and you notice that everyone else kind of sits back and no one would dare, you know, enter into that conversation because as the leader, you've asked a question, but you've already kind of said your piece, that could be an indication that you've got a little bit of work to do because you're trying to prove something. You're trying to prove to all of these people subconsciously that you're worthy and that you're valuable and that you matter and that you should be trusted as a leader because you've got all the answers. That's one way. I think that it's really this recognition of how, or a question rather, of when I notice things inside of my work environment that are frustrating to me, asking yourself the question, how did I contribute to that?
Mm, yeah.
Right? What was my responsibility, or how could I take ownership for how this happened? Which is really hard for people because we are so accustomed to blaming, finding fault, judging other people. And that's a really great signal. If you find yourself judging people constantly
Oh,
and never looking at how you contributed to a situation, that's a great place to say, I might need some work there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I say this a lot, and I maybe read this somewhere in the description of your book, but radical self-responsibility. In fact, when I started my health coaching practice, I was like going to make this a non-negotiable, is like radical self-responsibility, right? I just love it because
Yeah.
it is a little radical. Like you do have to get a little radical and courageous enough to like make yourself look at what you're responsible for. Um, and then like kind of goes towards as well, and like putting that, you take responsibility and then allowing other people to take responsibility is just that quote that's like, you can truly only help people to the degree in which they're willing to help themselves.
Yeah.
Right? So it
Yeah.
can be a little,
It's fascinating that you and I use the word radical, right?
yeah,
If we actually take some of the wisdom from indigenous cultures, this is the way that they do conflict. This is the way that they resolve conflict. Very
yeah,
different from how we do it in Western colonialized cultures. They come to the table saying, I have caused harm by doing the following, right? And then on the other side of the table, the other person says, I have caused harm to you by doing the following. And that's where they start in
mhm,
conflict resolution. It's not a radical idea. It's actually a very old, wise, indigenous idea or concept. And it's incredibly effective because what you're doing is you're not coming to the table with saying, you did this to me, automatically our scared animal, that
yeah,
sort of reptilian brain kicks in, like, I'm not safe, someone's attacking me. So I
yeah,
have to then be defensive. It's coming to the table and saying, you don't have to be defensive here. I'm going to be the one to own up and take ownership and be accountable for the actions or the words or the ways in which I've caused some kind of harm or challenge here.
yeah,
It's a beautiful way of being. And this is why I think so many people have trouble with conflict resolution. A lot of people, again, back to leadership, many people-pleasing leaders will avoid conflict as much as possible, right? I don't want to fire this person. I don't want to call this person out, hold this person accountable for work that they didn't do correctly or didn't do at all. But it's really kind to do those things,
yeah,
to say, hey, I've noticed that this didn't get done properly. I just want to own that I actually didn't communicate properly that this was the deadline, or I didn't support you in the ways that would have made you successful in delivering this work product, right?
yeah.
It's a very different way that is going to be on the receiving end if a leader came to you, from that lens or that standpoint.
Yeah, that's vulnerability or
Totally.
authenticity, right? Like
Sure.
it's just as a leader, like how empowering if your leader came up to you and was like, "Hey, oh my gosh, please forgive me. I dropped the ball on this and it enabled a situation that maybe, and then it encourages us to take responsibility, right?"
Yeah.
Um, Such great information. So I guess I want to ask you, this wasn't on like the little list that I was looking at of questions, how would you summarize your number one leadership tip? If the leaders were listening to this, going to take this away today, what is this concise, summarized leadership tip?
I would say the number one thing that you can do is start working on healing.
Mm.
Even if you believe that you didn't have trauma in childhood, because there are a lot of people who say, I look at that ACEs study, that adverse childhood experiences, and I look at all 10 of those things. I didn't have a parent who was incarcerated. My parents never got divorced. There was no illness in my family. I didn't have physical abuse. Like all of these things just don't apply to me. I had a great childhood. So like healing doesn't resonate for me. My invitation to them is I can guarantee that at some point in your upbringing, let's call it 0 to 14, or sometime in, let's say, 0 to 24, right? You
Yeah.
had experiences where you were overwhelmed, where you felt abandoned by someone, betrayed, humiliated. There are lots of ways in which, and some people call that small t trauma. But I think the problem in calling it small t trauma is that we compare it to those big T traumas and we're like, oh, it's not so bad, right? I wasn't physically abused or sexually assaulted when I was younger, so I don't have it so bad. I have nothing to heal from, or I have nothing to complain about, or nothing to work on. And nothing could be further from the truth, because those small T traumas really add up and they compound, and they're more likely to have happened continuously over time. And, there's a lot of healing that's needed from that. And listen, we can all, understand, I think, that there's always room for improvement. So even if you think that you're a great leader, there is room for improvement. And I think the way in, talked about ways in before,
Yeah.
the way in is that, wouldn't you want to do work that benefited you, every other person in your life, regardless of whether that was personal or professional relationships, and also contribute in a more meaningful way to your community? You know, there are so many gifts that each one of us comes into the world having, and healing is actually the inroads to figuring out how to take those gifts and apply them in the world.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't you want to do that?
Yeah. I love that. Explore your trauma, you guys. Explore it, because
Yeah.
suffering is something we will not escape in this world. I like to say it's like, what is it, like a law of polarity, right? Is that our life has good and bad, and the bad is purposeful. Like you had talked about, integration is the purpose of trauma, is to integrate the wisdom.
Yeah.
We're not a
Very well said.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
love it. Kelly, I cannot wait to read this book. So thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast today, and just like courageously bringing awareness to trauma healing in leadership, right? So we can become more conscious leaders. And I think, what did you say? Like, help this ecosystem kind of come back to this more regenerative, sort of natural, harmonious way of
Yeah.
existing.
It's possible. I really believe it's possible. It may not be in my lifetime or yours, but it is possible. And I want to be part of that little, cohort that is trying to bring that about. That feels like part of my purpose and part of my calling.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you for sharing that. Please share, where can people find out more about you and all that you have to offer?
Oh, just on my website, which is klcampbell.com.
klcampbell.com. Thank you so much, Kelly. Have a great day.
Thank you.